Morning, December 25, 1979. Almost 300 military transport aircraft are lined up at airfields of the Middle Asia. Inside cargo cabins are combat equipment and landing troops. A signal comes in and aircraft groups, one after another with roaring engines and clouds of dust, start into the air. It all looks more like a great relocation of people. In the next 3 days, the intensive work does not slow down. A constant engine's roar of heavy aircraft hangs over the airfields. That's how the picture of the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan looked. In the first days of the operation, almost 8,000 people, 900 items of equipment, and over 1,000 tons of cargo were relocated. And this was only 2% of the enormous volume of transportation performed by the Soviet military transport aviation in that war. From the very appearance of such means of transport as aircraft, it was naturally designated for relocation of cargoes and people. Invention of a parachute brought up the idea of landing troops, people and cargoes dropped from the aircraft. Such attempts took place in the leading aviation countries as far back as the 20s of the last century. In the same 20s, military theorists of the young Soviet Republic developed a theory of a deep offensive operation on exporting revolution to other countries. The massive assault forces, as an offensive tool, were to play a leading role in the deal. However, those plans were yet far from realization. The basis for the creation of the assault forces were laid down by the beginning of the 30s, when heavy aircraft of domestic design were put in service and production of parachutes was started. The first experimental assault force was created in March 1931 in the Leningrad military district. It comprised 12 TB-1 bombers and 10 P-5 support aircraft. Initially, TB-1 was designed by the Tupolev Design Bureau as a bomber. But with the appearance of more contemporary combat equipment, TB-1 was transferred to perform transport tasks. However, its narrow fuselage was not exactly suitable to host assault troops. Therefore, special cabins were suspended beneath the aircraft. Soon the experimental force grew into an air brigade and was equipped with a more powerful TB-3 bomber. Although it had the same problem as TB-1, it was not suitable to perform specific assault tasks. In order to drop paratroopers, aircraft had to fly at a low speed. More than that, the paratroopers located outside worsened its air shape, and the aircraft piloting was becoming difficult and simply dangerous. The aircraft could carry vehicles, light tanks, cannons, and other equipment as a suspended load. However, flight characteristics in this event, its speed and range in the first place, significantly dropped. Nevertheless, the transport aviation potential grew from one year to another. During the September 1934 military maneuvers, almost 600 paratroopers were dropped from the aircraft. 1 year after, at the same kind of maneuvers, the assault force was twice as big. While at the 1936 maneuvers, an entire air assault division was redeployed, and that was over 5,000 people. By the end of the 30s, the Red Army was tested in a series of minor but quite realistic wars. Combat experience at the Hassan Lake and at Halkingol showed the significance of the transport aviation in the provision of troop support. The undeveloped roads in those areas and their complete uselessness in the breakup season left no other logistic means except aircraft. 150 aircraft took place in the military raid in Bessarabia, and over 7,000 men were parachuted. That's how our assault forces were dropped over the fields of Bessarabia, carrying liberation to the working people from Romanian boyars. The most hard was the war with Finland. The Red Army generals planned to cope with it within 3 weeks, but the war continued for 4 winter months. Due to mediocre leadership, entire combat units were surrounded, and there was no other way but to support them by air. Flights were performed under heavy conditions in snow, frost, and fog. The shipment volume turned out to be unexpectedly huge. Aircraft from almost all military districts and even from the civil air fleet had to be employed. The passenger PS-84 helped a lot to resolve the problem. Its production was started in the USSR just before the war with Finland, under a license of the American Douglas Company. This aircraft had an advanced for its time radio and electronic equipment, blind flight tools, automatic pilot control, and means for defrosting. Of all Soviet aircraft of that time, PS-84 was the most suitable for troops and cargo's transportation. It could take 21 paratrooper and up to 2 tons of cargo on board. Almost 5,000 of these aircraft were manufactured. Since September 1942, it was renamed into Li-2 after Boris Lisunov, the chief engineer of the plant at which this aircraft was made. Apart from aircraft, gliders were thought to be used for transportation tasks. They were simple to build and cost-efficient. Several types of gliders were being produced in series. Most unusual projects were offered. Thus, Oleg Antonov offered an idea of a flying tank. Wings were supposed to be mated to a light tank, and it would then be towed by an aircraft as a glider. Tests were performed, although they had no practical result. The Soviet Union entered the Great Patriotic War having no time to build its efficient transport aviation. In the meantime, the war was turning global and demanded relevant volume of air shipments, but they were nothing to be performed on. The scanty transport aviation fleet suffered notable losses from the first German bombings. Once again, frontline aviation and the civil air fleet were used, of which special-purpose air groups were formed. Everything that could fly was employed. This aircraft, in its numerous modifications, found its use in almost all military and civil applications. As to air transportation, sometimes only U-2 was capable of performing communication and support of partisan, since it did not require any big and prepared landing strips. The aircraft was used to deliver single intelligence officers over the front line. Several U-2 ambulance versions were made to transport the wounded. outdated R-5 reconnaissance aircraft were involved in transportation as well. It did not have internal volume sufficient for transportation, therefore it was equipped with suspended cassettes, each carrying up to 10 paratroopers. Those were hard times for the transportation staff, military units relocation, evacuation of the wounded, deliveries of ammunition and food to the front. But with all this daily intensive work, the main task, assault troops landing, was never forgotten. The first in the war troops landing was made on June 29, 1941. 300 German tanks ran out of gas near the town of Slutsk. An assault team of 64 paratroopers was sent to destroy them. In October, near Mtsensk, an assault group stopped Guderian tanks moving towards Moscow for over 2 weeks. In January 1942, near Vyazma, 7,000 paratroopers were landed throughout 11 nights. They fought in the enemy's rear for 4 months, and all this time transport aircraft were bringing them support. Supply of the surrounded Leningrad occupies a special page in the history of transport aviation. In order to increase Lee-2 load capacity, the aircraft was stripped from all seats and even upholstery. Aircraft were bringing food and medicine to the surrounded city, taking people out on their way back. The route went over Ladoga Lake. In order not to be detected, aircraft flew right over the water edge. Partisan activities brought a new transportation task, supply to partisan units. Flights were mostly performed at night, with landing on badly lightened grounds of limited sight. 10 p.m. Right on time. Fly away. Junkers are in the air. Take out the boxes. Lieutenant, help. That's all. Bring the wounded. You have 2 minutes. 21, 22, 23. That's all. No more space, guys. Take all, quick. Quick, quick. Ivan Kuzmich, huge overload. 40 people. We can take only 23. It won't take off. So what? Are we out on a walk? I won't leave them here. I'll make it. During the war, a minor amount of such light transportation aircraft as Yak-6, She-2, captured Junkers U-52 and Zibel 204 were used. However, the majority of shipments were performed on Lee-2. From 1943, the transportation fleet was replenished with the Douglas C-47 brought by Lend-Lease. Like Lee-2, it was based on the passenger DC-3. C-47 main difference from its Russian analog was in the large cargo door, which allowed to load even Willis-type vehicles. The American aircraft was deemed more reliable, and it was sent to perform the most serious tasks. Successful construction became the key to the Lee-2 and C-47 long life. Moreover, the first Sergei Ilyushin's aircraft resembled Douglas a lot. Upon the end of the military activities in Europe, transportation aviation continued experiencing hard times. It took part in moving out numerous trophies from Germany. Besides, Soviet military units were being transported to the Far East, where they were concentrated to fight Japan. The military advance started in August 1945. Japanese defense was weak and Soviet tanks broke away from their supply bases for hundreds of kilometers, so that fuel and ammunition had to be delivered by aircraft. The Second World War experience showed how significant transport aviation was in combat conditions. 1/3 of all air flights during the war were made in performance of transportation purposes. A conclusion was to be made. Transport aviation should be established as a separate structure equipped with special aircraft. The United States followed exactly this way. They created aircraft of different carrying capacity and range, first with piston engines and then with gas turbine engines. Such variety responded to the American military doctrine, according to which military transport aviation as means of supply was given one of the highest priorities. In the second half of the 50s, the U.S. military transport aviation was equipped with the C-130 Hercules turboprop aircraft, which became a workhorse not only for the U.S. Army but for the armies of many other countries of the world. The Soviet Union, which was spending enormous money for the restoration of its economy, just as before, aircraft of different types were being modified for the transportation purposes. Push it up. In 1948, the landing transport aviation was equipped with Il-12D. This aircraft was not much faster than Li-2, but had one undoubted advantage, a cargo hatch on the left side. Review of the wartime assault operations, especially those in Normandy, where an enormous number of assault gliders were used, influenced the creation of similar machines in the USSR. That's how C-25 glider designed by Pavel Tsibin and Yak-14 glider of Alexander Yakovlev appeared. While the first of them could take around 2 tons of cargo on board, the payload of the other was twice as much. A spacious cabin allowed Yak-14 to carry 2 trucks with cannons and automobiles, what no other aircraft on service at that time could do. In the growing confrontation between the USSR and USA in the 40s, the Arctic region started to gain a lot of importance. Exploration of the polar areas could hardly be achieved without the transport aviation. In spring 1948, a high-latitude expedition on Li-2 aircraft took place. 2 years later, a unique operation was performed. Aircraft towing gliders went toward the Northern Pole. They were carrying cargoes for the development of the iced takeoff and landing strips in the region. Such aerodromes were supposed to become a hub for the long-range bombers flying toward America. At that time, they were the main means of the nuclear weapons delivery. Tu-4 became the first Soviet carrier of this kind with a range of 5,000 kilometers. The range was important for the transport aircraft as well. Although Tu-4 was soon substituted by a jet aircraft, it continued its career in the transport aviation. In 1955, bombers underwent refurbishment into Tu-4D assault version. 29 paratroopers prepared for parachute landing take their places in the front and rear bomb sections. Since internal volumes were insufficient, special cargo cabins were built and suspended under the wing. Loaded cabins are carried under the wings. Here is how they are dropped, and the troops leave the aircraft in one move. The Tu-4D deficiency was in its dependence upon aerodromes with good pavement and a long takeoff and landing strip. It also had limited assault capabilities. Interesting enough that from the beginning, Tupolev offered Air Force an assault version of Tu-4 Tu-75 with a capacious fuselage. However, at that time, long-range bombers and jet fighters were a higher priority, and the aircraft was not put in production. By mid-50s, USSR was way far behind USA in the sphere of transport aviation. Besides, primitive navigating equipment of the Soviet transport aircraft limited their usage a lot. It was impossible, for example, to drop paratroopers at night and in bad weather due to absence of the plane-to-plane communication, or it was impossible to fly in a close formation to make a compact assault landing. Until certain time, attempts were made to improve efficiency of the military transport aviation by means of its reorganization, but that did not bring much change. Principal changes occurred in 1955 when the Military Transport Aviation, or MTA, obtained the status of a separate branch of the Air Force. Marshal Nikolai Skripko assisted the MTA establishment a lot. He became commander of the Assault Transport Aviation in 1950 and served in that position for 19 years. In the same 1950, requirements to the specialized transport aircraft were formulated. Takeoff and landing were supposed to be arranged from sand as well as from limited strips, and flights were supposed to be performed in difficult weather conditions day and night. The aircraft was supposed to have a spacious cargo cabin, a range, a wide hatch in the rear, and a loading ramp. High wing became a characteristic feature of a transport aircraft. Such aircraft started to enter service from 1958. It was a turboprop AN-8 designed by Oleg Antonov's design bureau. Its load lifting capacity amounted to 11 tons, which was 3 times more than of its predecessors. It could carry and parachute large military technique and cargoes. It had heavy-duty landing gear to operate from sand and snow-covered aerodromes. This aircraft did not stay long in production. The range of the MTA service in the interest of different types of forces was growing continuously, and an aircraft with much higher payload was already required. Moreover, missile forces were developing fast, and they were usually deployed in places to which one can get only by air. So right after AN-8, there appeared AN-12, with twice bigger payload and an expanded flight range. Unlike its predecessor, it had 4 instead of 2 turboprop engines. In December 1957, AN-12 made its first flight. Just like AN-8, the prototype was piloted by test pilot Yakov Vernikov. AN-12 appeared to be easy and unpretentious. As to the number of copies produced and the amount of modifications, this machine has no match among the Soviet transport aircraft. Large cargo cabin allowed to carry an entire variety of the military assault equipment, as well as items of other types of armed forces with a mass of up to 20 tons. Landing capabilities grew significantly with the appearance of the multi-sphere parachute systems. For a long time, An-12 remained the main Soviet transport aircraft, performing various tasks, from aerospace equipment tests to scientific research in polar latitudes. A unique 26,000-kilometer-long flight from Moscow to Antarctic was performed in 1961. Passenger An-10, designed in parallel with An-12, also served in the Army for a while. However, this aircraft did not adapt itself to MTA. Tupolev also attempted to create a military transport aircraft on the basis of the passenger Tu-104. Such version was identified as Tu-107 and it differed from other machines of the same designation by its speed. However, all of its other characteristics did not comply with the requirements of the specialized transport aircraft. Helicopters Mi-4 also served in the military transport aviation throughout several years. They differed beneficially from aircraft by their independence of any developed takeoff and landing strips. However, their flight range per 100 kilometers in no way complied with the global tasks put upon MTA. Therefore, since 1960, there have been no helicopters in the Soviet military transport aviation. By 1970s, development of military equipment turned impetuous. It became more powerful, heavier, and larger. Therefore, An-12 could not fully resolve transportation tasks. This aircraft could now carry only 20% of the military equipment assortment. It was time for even more larger aircraft. That's how the An-22 Antaeus heavy military transport aircraft appeared. The first flight of this giant took place in February 1965. Pilot Yuri Kurlin took this aircraft into the air. An-22 is the first in the world wide-body and the largest for its time transport aircraft. Thanks to its multiple landing gear with pneumatic pressure control, this aircraft can land on sand and snow-covered airdromes. The maximum takeoff weight of this giant is 225 tons, while the maximum payload is 80 tons. The Soviet Union proudly demonstrated Antaeus at the Le Bourget Aviation Salon, where undoubtedly it was a superstar. Paris International Aviation and Space Salon at Le Bourget. An American B-58 bomber crashed at landing before the eyes of thousands of spectators. This sensational news was forced from the front lines by the appearance at Le Bourget of the world's largest aircraft designed by Oleg Antonov. 41 world records were set on this aircraft. Antaeus became the first aircraft to lift a 100-ton cargo. There it is. the combat power of the military transport aviation. Practically any military equipment which is currently used in the Soviet Army can be loaded into these aircraft. These powerful machines make the basis of the military transport aviation. They can carry not only paratroopers at enormous distance, but can supply them with heavy armament. AN-22 can take on board up to 290 soldiers or 150 paratroopers, tanks, assault combat vehicles, missile units, and practically any type of frontline aircraft and helicopters. The takeoff is soon. Loading is on the way. Every detail is important and there could be no miscalculations. A minor mistake on the ground can be hard to correct in the sky. Increased capabilities of the military transport aviation make paratroopers many times more powerful. With the Antaeus appearance, the problem of various types of the armed forces equipment, air transportation, including strategic missile forces, was practically resolved. Progress of the military transport aviation could be seen overseas as well. C-141 Starlifter entered the United States Military Transport Aviation Service in mid-60s. Its maximum weight lifting capacity was almost 40 tons. It was not enough at that time, which made Americans to think of a more powerful transport aircraft. C-5 Galaxy became the one. In the 60s, capabilities of the Soviet transport aviation were several times tested in exact operations. Intensive oil field explorations started in those years. All that was required, tubes and special equipment, was being delivered by transport aircraft. They were also carrying out gold and diamonds from Yakutia. In 1966, an earthquake occurred in Tashkent. The entire nation rushed to help the city on the wings of the transport aviation. Aircraft were delivering armament to many developing countries of Asia and Africa in return for loyalty of their leadership to the Soviet Union. In 1970, a destructive earthquake occurred in Peru. The Soviet Union sent transport aircraft full of hospital equipment and medicine. The route was 17,000 kilometers only one way. The difficulty was that the Soviet military transport aviation had practically no experience of international flights. Besides, the just-commissioned AN-22 had no adequate navigating equipment. And then the Soviet military aircraft had to fly over the territories of their potential enemies, Canada and USA. Therefore, for the sake of conspiracy, AN-22 were painted into the colors of Aeroflot, while the crews were dressed in civil pilot uniform. Transport aircraft made a total of 17 flights to Peru. In MTA, there was always a tendency toward aircraft payload increase. However, there were other spheres where air transportation were not so massive. Minor aircraft were required accordingly. They were used in the Air Force transportation detachments and in the civil air fleet in the interests of various organizations. In the beginning of the 60s, a transportation version of the AN-24 passenger aircraft was built in the Antonov Design Bureau. This aircraft did not have a cargo hatch and any special equipment. Therefore, the layout had to be radically redone. That's how AN-26 aircraft appeared, which was ideal for transporting cargoes of up to 5 tons. Later on, AN-26 was refurbished into an aircraft identified as AN-32. It had everything optimized for the use in hot climate and highland. In the second half of the 70s, a more fast turbojet AN-72 was built to substitute AN-26. An interesting combination of engine's location and a high-lift wing significantly improved the takeoff and landing characteristics of the aircraft. It did not get into MTA as well, however, it was used by the Air Force Transportation and Border Patrol units. The civil modification of this aircraft was identified as AN-74. But let's get back to the heavy military transport aircraft. Il-76 became the aircraft of the new generation, combining all achievements of the scientific and technical progress. It was made in the Ilyushin Design Bureau under the supervision of Genrikh Novozhilov. In March 1971, test pilot Eduard Kuznetsov took the prototype into the air from the Moscow Central Aerodrome. Il-76 was deemed to substitute AN-12 in order to expand capabilities of the military transport aviation without increasing its quantity. In reality, both aircraft were operational together for a long time. A lot of things were very well thought of in the development of Il-76. The aircraft was perfectly adapted to land paratroopers. High speed allows it to reach the goal fast, and there, the huge aircraft can drop its speed to a minimum. The slower it flies, the safer it is to leave it. Parachuting in 4 streams provides for the compact troop landing. Leaving Il-76 paratroopers are covered by the side doors and the cargo hatch leaves. The aircraft's powerful high-lift wing provides for the perfect takeoff and landing characteristics. Less noisy and more efficient turbofan engines were applied in the military transport aircraft for the first time. They were equipped with thrust reverse units, which provided for significantly shorter landing. Overcoming enemy air defense, Il-76 may fly at an utmost low altitude, and it will still have the ability to drop equipment. For the first time in the Soviet military transport aviation history, the use of concrete takeoff and landing strips instead of the sand ones has become a priority. At the same time, if needed, Il-76 can land on rather inconvenient strips. Later on, more improved modifications, Il-76M and Il-76D appeared. Modernization increased the aircraft payload capacity from 33 to 50 tons. Around 300 aircraft of this type were commissioned to MTA. Military transport aviation constantly mastered its skills at maneuvers of different levels and range. At one of the maneuvers of the 70s, 8,000 paratroopers and 152 items of combat equipment were parachuted within 22 minutes. At other maneuvers in 1979, MTA aircraft relocated an airborne division within a very short period of time from Tula to Transbaikalia. During the same maneuvers, a hidden relocation of a huge amount of frontline aircraft was performed at a distance of 7,200 kilometers. New capabilities of transport aircraft were being mastered. Inter-aircraft navigation equipment allowed to perform at different combat lines with prescribed intervals in different weather conditions day and night. Utilization of the inter-aircraft navigation equipment provides for the combat line flight's reliability, formation management precision, flight safety, and high parachuting rate. Very soon, the skills acquired at maneuvers were used in real combat conditions. In 1979, leadership of the USSR decided to send troops to Afghanistan. All subsequent 10 years of the war, supply of the enormous military group was performed through air, which was the main and often the only possible way of supply. Aircraft delivered everything, from armament and ammunition to food and construction material. For example, in 1980, the rate of flights reached 200 per month. Since 1984, enemy started frequent use of portable air defense systems. In order to protect aircraft, they were equipped with decoy flare dispensers. Moreover, crews started to perform large sheer takeoff and landing tactics. They would gain altitude or descend at a steep spiral, keeping within the airfield guarded zone where they were protected by helicopters. After the decision to withdraw forces, the main load was again put on MTA. In the 80s, the power of the Soviet MTA grew fast. Annual increase of its capacity amounted to 15%. But still, it could not keep up with the appetite of its colleagues. The weight and quantity increase of the airborne equipment went even faster. This predetermined the appearance of AN-124 Ruslan in the MTA. It was built under the supervision of the chief designer Peter Volobuyev. In the end of 1982, the sample of this aircraft entered tests. AN-124 is the biggest military transport aircraft in the world. Its weightlifting capacity amounts to 120 tons. Unique dimensions of the Ruslan cabin allow to transport practically 100% of the armament assortment. AN-124 has two decks with cargo hatches in the front and rear parts of the fuselage. For loading and unloading, Ruslan is equipped with two overhead cranes and special loading runners. The bending system makes loading more comfortable. Despite of its enormous takeoff weight of almost 400 tons, AN-124 can take off even from sand. High-efficient turbofan engines and the supercritical profile wing provided Ruslan with outstanding flight characteristics. This unique aircraft has set 20 world records, including 171 ton of weightlifting and 20,151 kilometer of flight range. It is interesting to compare how MTA capabilities increased throughout the last 50 years. Total payload of one Ruslan is equal to weightlifting of 60 Li-2 aircraft. And with the account of the speed and flight range, the Ruslan transport power is equal to the power of 4 Li-2 air divisions. On the basis of AN-124, a more powerful AN-225 Mriya aircraft was built. Creation of this super heavy aircraft relates to development of the Energy Buran space shuttle system. Mriya was supposed to transport system components to the launching site. In this particular way, with the orbit aircraft on its deck, Mriya was demonstrated at the air show at Le Bourget in 1989. This aircraft holds the weightlifting record of 253 tons, while the aircraft's flight weight amounted to 585 tons. Mriya is a number one among record holders. It holds 240 records. In the beginning of 90s, the Antonov Design Bureau developed another transport aircraft, AN-70. But it was unlucky since its development coincided in time with the USSR collapse. AN-70 made its first flight in December 1994. It was supposed to be a joint Russian-Ukrainian project. However, like many other projects of transition period, it was never fulfilled, at least so far. At present, the Russian military transport aviation operates Antaeus and Ruslan. But the main aircraft as to both quantity and the group combat capabilities is Il-76. The potential of its construction allowed to produce many different modifications. A civil cargo aircraft, an early warning radar aircraft, an air tanker, and numerous flying testbeds. In the 90s, the Ilyushin Design Bureau offered the new Il-76MF version. It has a longer fuselage, which enables to transport larger cargoes with a total mass of up to 60 tons. The aircraft has more powerful and efficient PS-90 engines. On the basis of Il-76, a new special firefighting version was developed, which can drop 40 tons of fire-extinguishing liquid within a matter of 5 to 6 seconds. With new engines and modern avionics, these aircraft will continue to fulfill the set tasks. The Russian military transport aviation regularly take part in the command maneuvers, including the joint ones, for example, with India and China. Of course, they are not as big as before, but the world has changed and confrontation has gone. transport aircraft have found application in civil air companies specializing in shipping commercial cargo. Unique capabilities of Russian aircraft enjoy demand around the world. And in Russia itself, with its huge undeveloped territories, transport aviation will always be in demand.